Hi everyone, and welcome to a very special video of Tank Archives, because today we're not going to be talking about tanks. Well, something tank adjacent, but a little bit of a deviation from our usual topic. In fact, if you're here to only look at the cameras and you don't care about tanks or armored warfare at all, you're more than welcome to skip to the timestamp below. For everyone else, watch on. Alright, so in conversations about Soviet tank gunnery, including the ones that you've probably seen on my YouTube channel, I often hear this opinion that it doesn't matter if Soviet tank guns could penetrate enemy armor at hundreds of meters or thousands of meters away. It doesn't matter if the mechanical accuracy of the gun barrel was good enough to hit a tank-sized target at 2 kilometers or even longer, because for one simple reason. Soviet tank sights were so poor, they were so cloudy and blurry that it was simply impossible to hit any target at all, and well, who cares how powerful your gun is at that point. And this is an interesting opinion. Hard to prove, hard to disprove, because of course it's really easy to test if a gun can penetrate some armor. You can just go and look at the hole it made, but if you're looking to see if a gun sight can resolve a target to a satisfactory amount at a certain range, it's kind of a little bit more difficult, and in all my years of research I haven't really been able to find any definitive comparison performed by any nation, so we kind of have to rely on circumstantial evidence and scraps here and there to put together a complete picture. So for the first step, let's go to the people involved in the tank combat and see what they thought about these tanks and their tank sights. The Soviets, for example, for the T-34-85 were adamant that tank crews should fire at a range as long as possible, up to 2,000 meters. That's because the T-34-85 had a very modern and very powerful 85mm gun. However, the 45mm of sloped armor on the front of the hull was a little bit iffy by the middle and end of the Second World War. And so rather than putting a whole bunch of armor on their tanks so they could take a hit at a close range, the Soviets decided to put a more powerful tank gun so they could simply fire at their enemies at a range that, for example, a Panzer IV would not be able to penetrate the front of the T-34 at all. As for the Germans, well, they kind of also agree that the T-34 is a very powerful enemy, particularly in the early war, because they could set up in a favorable position and just shoot and shoot and shoot and take out German tanks at a range of up to 1,800 meters, which made it very difficult to maneuver and to approach the tank at a close range, where the Panzer IV with a short 75mm gun or a Panzer III with a 50mm gun were actually capable of penetrating it. So as you can see, both the Germans and the Soviets agree that Soviet tanks can fight effectively at a very long range. So well, if the Soviets and the Germans agree, where can we get some more information? Well, this is actually where the Western Allies come in. The infamous report from the Aberdeen Proving Grounds says in no uncertain terms that the gun sights of the T-34 tank are the best in the world and simply incomparable to any tank sights known in America or around the world. However, you might want to take that phrase with a little bit of a caveat. The actual full report on the T-34 tank composed at the Aberdeen Proving Grounds is not publicly available. What is circulated on the internet as the report is actually a translation of information gathered by Soviet intelligence. And so maybe they got some kind of rumors or scraps or drafts or something like that. Maybe this information is not entirely accurate. But this is where we can go to the British. The British report on the T-34 tank composed at the School of Tank Technology. Usually these reports steer away from any kind of qualitative analysis and focus on quantitative analysis, but they do give us finally some concrete numbers, particularly around light transmission. So the light transmission of the T-34's periscopic sight was 26.3%. You know, it's a quarter of the light that comes in one side, comes out the other. It's for photographers in the audience, 2 stops. It's not nothing, but it's quite a bit of light is lost. The telescopic sight transmitted 39.2% of the light. A little bit better, but again, less than half. 1.5 stops of light lost. not really ideal. So one might come to the conclusion that the T-34's gun sights are quite dim and useless, but of course everything has to be understood in context. For example, the same British lab investigated a Panzer IV's gun sight, the TZF-5B, and what they found was that the light transmission was even worse, at a mere 20% lower than either the T-34's periscopic or the telescopic gun sight. Furthermore, the sharpness of the sight was really quite poor. Only the center was sharp and the edges were quite blurry, and the British estimated that only 8 degrees of the full field of view were actually useful for spotting the target. So while they don't exactly praise Soviet sights or make any kind of statement about their quality in the report on the T-34, there is no such disclaimer or complaint about poor edge-to-edge sharpness. So as you can see in this kind of lab analysis, the T-34's gun sights beat the German Panzer IV gun sights quite handily. Now, of course, this is a very small amount of data. This is the most that I could find over my years of research. And of course, it doesn't really paint a full picture, but the picture that it does paint shows that, well, maybe these myths aren't exactly correct. And in the T-30-45 tanks that I've had the pleasure of being inside of and driving around at museums and reenactments, the gun sight seemed quite serviceable. I could get a clear picture of what I was looking at. It was definitely clear enough to target and shoot at an enemy tank. Now, fortunately for period optics, the condition really depends on how well they were stored. Optics are quite vulnerable to things like moisture, light, particularly UV light. They're susceptible to mold, they're susceptible to fungus. And well, even if you have a really, really well-preserved piece, for some reason, museums are very reluctant to let me pull parts out of their tanks and take them home to play with. And so I had to find something else to run a conclusive test on. Now, as many of you might know, if you follow me on social media, particularly Reddit, I am a reenactor and I am a photographer. And what that means is I have quite a substantial collection of period cameras, particularly mid to late 1930s and early 1940s. Now, rather than just collecting them, I do use them. The small part of the collection that you see behind me is all functional. I've tested all of them with film. I make a point of not collecting any camera that I wouldn't use, just because then my entire house would be full of cameras. This last weekend, I attended a Kino Tank weekend at the Canadian Tank Museum, formerly known as the Ontario Regiment Museum, and I actually ended up taking a couple of photos of exactly the same subject, in exactly the same conditions. It was nice and bright and sunny for both days, on exactly the same film. This ACHTUNG NK2SH. I didn't pick it for any particular properties, just because it came with a coupon for free film development. And so I could get a comparable test. The exact same film, the exact same focal length, the exact same conditions, the exact same subject, and developed at the exact same photography lab, and then of course scanned on the exact same scanner. And so this lets us conduct a side-by-side test to see, is there really a difference in how these cameras perform, how Soviet versus German optics perform, and, well, which one's better? First, let me introduce the cameras. The first one, and it's a little bit of a cliche, is, of course, the Leica. This is a 1935 Leica III model. As you can see, works fine, equipped with the auxiliary viewfinder for lenses that aren't the 50mm kit lens, and a 135mm telephoto lens. This is a somewhat recent acquisition. I actually got it shortly before this event, but it was thoroughly tested to make sure it worked for the event. So, Leica is probably a household name in photography. Many of you, even if you aren't camera nerds, know what this is. Leica cameras began their lineage in 1925 when Leitz company from Wetzlar in Germany developed a 35mm camera that, well, kind of looks like the Leicas today. And this camera, the so-called Barnack Leica after its inventor, it took the photography world by storm because it was the first truly popular 35mm camera. These cameras were valued all over the world, and these still are, and of course, because of the Leitz brand name, these still bring quite a hefty premium. But I'm fortunate enough to have one in very good condition that works perfectly. This counterpart on the Soviet side is the Fed, which stands for Felix Edmundovich Dzerzhinsky, after the name of the Soviet politician and internal security guy. And so you might say, Peter, you just showed me this. This is exactly the same camera, and, well, not entirely. The Fed was a copy of the Leica II. You can see it does look very, very similar. It's just missing the slow speed dial. The lens installed on this one is a copy of a German lens. However, it's not a copy of the Leitz Elmar, which is a very similar looking lens, also 50mm that collapses like this. The optics used inside this lens are actually a copy of the Zeiss Tessar, and you can see Super Conta folding camera behind me that uses a Tessar lens as well. Two Super Contas actually, one f/35 and one f2.8. These are beautiful, lovely lenses. I do quite enjoy using those Super Contas. But I didn't use them for this comparison, so they're not going to be part of this video. They might be in a later video. Now you might say, hold on, why? It's not fair to use a copy. We need to look at what the Soviets could invent themselves. Well, as you probably might already know, or you've seen in my previous video, the USSR was actually very honest about its manufacturing abilities and not very honest about intellectual property. And so they really had no qualms about copying or buying what they couldn't copy. And so the first Soviet tanks built in the late 20s, early 30s would actually be used with imported Zeiss optics. And when the USSR got its production off the ground and could actually make its own optical glass, well, they just kept making copies of Zeiss optics because, you know, why not? And so even though this is a copy of a German design, it fits perfectly into this tank gun sight comparison. Another camera I took with me on that weekend is this. It is a Zeiss Icon Contax. They have very tricky shutters, but you can see this one also still works. The Contax was actually a reaction to the Leica because the large medium format cameras that you see behind me was actually the bread and butter of Carl Zeiss, and they didn't really pay much attention to this tiny, you know, 35mm film that was much smaller than 120 film, which would give you 6cm sized negatives, either 6x9 or 6x6, or in the case of that small camera there, 4.5 by 6 centimeters. The success of the Leica actually took them by surprise, and they made the Contax camera to capitalize on this newfound small format photography market. Unfortunately, the Contax was far too complicated and its shutter was far too unreliable, which is why most Contax cameras you see today are not working. This one is the Contax II. It is a slightly simpler version, but it still has the same strange shutter based on shutter ribbons. Rather than having a fabric curtain like the Leica does, it has this metallic sort of vertical shutter here. These are actually quite infamous for their low reliability, because over time the ribbons that hold this metal grate, they fray, they lose tension, you have to get them adjusted, and this is a very, very, very expensive process. And every year it becomes more expensive because there's just only so many photographers, or so many technicians rather, that are even willing to work on these things. So I'm getting some use out of mine while I still can. This one also has a telephoto lens. It is the Soviet Jupiter 11. Now, cheating a little bit, this is a post-war copy of the 135mm Zeiss Sonar. As you can see, the Soviets copied the glass. They didn't copy the actual form factor of the lens. They are a little bit different, but both are compatible with the Contax Kiev mount, because after the war, the Soviets took the Zeiss Icon factory for reparations, and they continued to produce the Contax under the name Kiev. This is a legitimate Contax, so no complaints that I'm using fake lenses with a fake body that don't give you that full Carl Zeiss performance. So all the 3 cameras that I showed you today are fully tested. I've used them at events before, aside from the Leica, which I only tested just walking around town, but both performed tremendously well at the Kino Tank Weekend, and they are in very, very good condition considering that they're pushing 90 years old at this point. And so without further ado, let's take a look at some photographs and see where Soviet cameras and German cameras compare. Let's take a look at our first pair of images. The first model is going to be the Leo tank, which is a light tank M3 or Stuart. The first picture you see here was taken with the Fed, so using the 3.5 50mm lens. And the second picture is taken using the Contax, so the f2 50mm lens as well. Now, there's probably not going to be a massive difference in the 2 pictures, so let's take a look at them side by side. Someone pointed out the Contax does have lower contrast. I'm actually willing to blame the scanner for that one. The tech probably set the boundaries incorrectly, because really, when we're talking about the level of detail and the sharpness and whatnot, the pictures are pretty much the same, and I'm pretty sure you could get the Contax photo looking exactly like the one taken with the Fed, given a little bit of fiddling with the sliders. In order to make this test as fair as possible, I did very minimal editing to all of these pictures, pretty much just cropping them. But if we want to evaluate the sharpness of the lenses, which is what we're here for, we can actually zoom in a little bit, and let's take a look at the suspension bogey in the center. You can see that the detail is pretty much exactly the same. You can make out all of the rivets, all of the nuts, and all the bolts on both cameras. And like I said, if you play with the contrast settings on the Contax, you'll get pretty much the same effect as on the Fed. Now, in order to really push the comparison, let's do what photographers derogatorily call pixel peeping. Zoom in to such great levels that really would not be encountered in photography, because back in the day you'd be printing this on an enlarger rather than zooming in a digital scan. But even looking at the scale of a single track link, well, all the detail is there. The Soviet lens and the German lens give pretty much identical levels of detail. You can see the track pin, you can see the end connector, absolutely everything. So as you can see, both lenses, the Soviet and the German one, give incredible levels of detail in this photograph. All right, time for our second pair of photographs. Here you could see the Ontario Regiment Museum's Hetzer. This is actually a post-war G13, but it has been restored lovingly and very accurately to what a wartime Hetzer would have looked like. But for the purposes of this demo, it's nice sharp angles and contrasting upper and lower front plates because of the way that the light falls. It makes a perfect example. And so again, there isn't really that much of a difference in quality, and you can actually see the contrast difference is negligible as well. So that's why I was willing to put up the difference in the previous set of photos to just the way the scanner was set up. Zooming in, again, very similar in quality. I wouldn't be able to say that one is better than the other necessarily. These are both great photos, sharp, nice contrast. If we're going to pixel peep, and again, this is not what this lens would have been intended for 90 years ago, but if we really zoom in, we can see that maybe the Fed is a little bit sharper. However, when you're zooming in with a rangefinder like that, this could also be attributed to user error, so I'm willing to make an excuse for that little bit of difference in sharpness. It could be a slight difference in the way the rangefinders are calibrated, or a slight mistake on my part in setting the distance. But as you can see, the Fed and the Contax, their 50mm lenses, perform pretty much equivalent in these conditions. For a third comparison, we're going to look at the longer 135mm telephoto lens. And now, fortunately, I don't have any subject that I got both on my Jupiter 11 and on my Leica Hector. But you can take a look at these two little RC tanks that we're driving around, and I think that the two pictures are comparable, and will let us take a look at how these two different lenses perform. Now, side by side, again, I would say this is too close to call. They both perform very, very well. They're both very contrasty, very sharp photos. And even so, with the rangefinder, the longer your magnification, the longer your focal length, the worse the error is. And as the subject approaches the camera, the focal depth actually decreases. So both of these would be quite susceptible to errors on the rangefinder. But I think that I nailed the focus in both cases. And if you, again, zoom in and pixel peep at just the tiniest details, the sharpness of the tracks and the headlights and things like that, I would say that the two cameras and the two lenses are pretty much identical. I mean, I think in this case, I would give a slight advantage to the German lens. But again, both lenses perform very well and both produce a very good picture. So as I mentioned before, all of these cameras and all of these lenses are something that I use very frequently, generally to good results. I mean, as a photographer, I'm still an amateur, and if you see issues with these photos, well, it's almost certainly due to my skill rather than any design or manufacturing defect with these lenses. I've been able to get some really good photos out of them over the years, and so if this video inspires you as a reenactor to pick up one of these vintage cameras, or maybe if you're a digital photographer looking to kick it old school, any of these would be a great addition to your arsenal. Now, as before, everything has to be understood in context. So in addition to all these photos that are good and nice and contrasty and sharp, I thought I'd show you some that, well, aren't. These photos come from arguably the worst lens in my collection, the Argus Cintar. This specific example actually predates the Cintar branding. This lens was used on the Argus C, not the Argus C3, not even the C2, but the original Argus C. This was a budget camera. This was not intended to be a very expensive, high quality camera. And you can very much see that even at fairly narrow apertures like 9 or 12.5, and this lens still does use the old style of apertures, the quality is not great. And so, as you can see, either Soviet lenses or German lenses of the period absolutely surpass the Argus in terms of contrast and sharpness. So why do Soviet cameras have such a poor reputation? Well, Stephen Dowling from Cosmophoto makes a very convincing argument. According to him, a lot of the cameras that are seen in the West were actually built during the perestroika years, particularly the tail end when the USSR was collapsing. And it's really, really difficult to continue producing a very precise product like a camera shutter or a camera lens when the whole country around you is falling apart and you're probably not even getting paid. Earlier cameras were built to a higher standard, and I would suggest that you buy an earlier camera, maybe from the late 70s or early 80s if you're going to buy a Soviet camera. But all cameras, like all mechanisms, need to be serviced. They have parts that wear out, they have springs that lose tension, they have shutter curtains that tear and fray, and so somebody needs to go in and fix it. And if you're paying $200 to get your camera serviced, regardless of who made it, a German or a Russian, well, are you going to pay $200 to a technician to get a $50 Zorky serviced? Probably not. But when your camera is a $1,000 Leica, the mental calculus is very different. However, the standards that these two cameras are being held to is the same. And so a well-maintained Leica is going to perform much better than a Zorky that spent 50 years in somebody's basement. Now that these cameras are a bit more scarce and worth a lot more money, and you see Soviet lenses, particularly desirable types in good condition, for hundreds or even over $1,000 on Facebook Marketplace or on eBay, maybe it's worth getting a Zorky serviced, and you see quite a number of cameras and lenses and get quite a significant bit of cult popularity in certain photography communities. But I digress. For the purposes of this video, you can see that Soviet glass was not necessarily any worse than German glass, whether for cameras or for gun sights. Now, is this a perfect comparison? Well, of course not. I can only afford so many lenses. I can only have time to shoot so much film. We're out there taking photos of actual real-life subjects and actual real-life field conditions rather than a grid or something that lets me zoom in and make minute measurements. I have could use a sharper film or a higher resolution scanner. But there's the thing, if you need all of these very precise instruments to tell the difference, well, does it really matter in the scenario that we're talking about, in this idea of tank-on-tank combat, where you need to see and identify an enemy tank at a range of 2,000 meters? Probably not. So I hope that this convinced you that Soviet glass was just as good as German glass, and Soviet gun sights as well as Soviet cameras are perfectly fine for the purposes that they were intended to carry out. Much like buying a Leica doesn't make you a better photographer, having a tank with a German scope in it doesn't necessarily give you any advantage over one that doesn't.